Welcome to a special episode of Project 250, A Glorious Day for America, the Battles of Lexington and Concord. As always, a chronicle of the people, places, and events of the American Revolution. Without further ado, here's what was happening 250 years ago today, April 19th, 1775.
Before delving too far into the events of April 19th, a bit of background about what happened during the days leading up to Lexington and Concord might be helpful, especially for our newer viewers. As the week began, in Massachusetts, the arrival of spring and warmer temperatures, usually a welcome relief from the harsh New England winter, instead created a sense of unease and anticipation of trouble ahead. In fact, just 3 days prior, on Thursday, April 16th, Dr. Joseph Warren had sent his favorite courier, Paul Revere, to Lexington with a warning for John Hancock and Samuel Adams that the British were planning to march on the town and arrest the two rebel leaders.
On Saturday, April 18th, General Gage set his plans in motion. Gage's plan was to march to Concord with a force of about 700 British regulars. Leaving before dawn, the troops would swiftly and quietly make their way to Concord, where they would seize the stockpiled weapons and supplies, then hurry back to Boston before the locals were even aware of what was happening. A supporting force, commanded by General Hugh Percy, would follow at around 5 a.m. The success of Gage's scheme depended heavily on speed and stealth, catching the rebels literally in their beds with a pre-dawn march. If all went according to plan, everyone would be safely back in Boston by that evening. However, as had been the case with Colonel Leslie's march to Salem a few weeks prior, things did not go as planned.
The fact was that Patriot leaders in Boston, as evidenced by Warren's warning to Hancock and Adams 2 days earlier, were well aware of Gage's plan. In fact, the rebels often knew a great deal about Gage's orders, in some cases even before they were issued. In retrospect, it is almost certain that there was a rebel spy within Gage's inner circle, or at least close to it. It has often been alleged, with little evidence, that General Gage's wife, Margaret Kemble Gage, was the informant, but this is largely speculative. At this point, we will probably never know with certainty who the informant was, or if they even existed.
Commanding the operation would be Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the 10th Regiment of Foot, with Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines serving as second-in-command. The British force would consist of companies from 10 regiments of foot, along with Pitcairn's 1st Marine Battalion, which included 1 company each of light infantry and grenadiers. In addition to seizing military supplies at Concord, Dr. Warren, as previously mentioned, believed the capture of Samuel Adams and John Hancock to be a key British objective. However, it bears noting that Gage, in his written instructions to Lieutenant Colonel Smith, never mentioned the arrest of Adams, Hancock, or anyone else for that matter. That Gage may have verbally ordered Smith to capture Adams and Hancock is of course a possibility. Still, the situation remains somewhat murky.
At around 10:30 that evening, Paul Revere, who had been selected by Warren as an alarm rider, was rowed across the Charles River from Boston to Charlestown by 2 friends. They landed just east of where the HMS Somerset lay at anchor. As is well known, Revere had arranged for 2 lanterns to be lit in the belfry of the Old North Church as a signal that the British were coming by water, via the Charles River. If the British came by land, via Boston Neck, 1 lantern would have been lit.
At approximately 11 p.m., roughly the same time that Revere reached Charlestown, the first wave of British soldiers began crossing the river. Almost immediately, things started to go wrong. The British managed to secure only about 20 longboats, which was roughly half the number needed to transport the troops across the Charles River. Consequently, It would take the British twice as long to cross the river as initially planned, putting the entire operation behind schedule from the start, and causing further delays as the night wore on.
While the British crossed the Charles River, Warren's other alarm rider, a Boston tanner named William Dawes, also set out for Lexington. While Revere traveled by water, Dawes took the land route, riding on horseback via Boston Neck. Revere and Dawes arrived in Lexington sometime between midnight and 12:30 a.m. Revere got there slightly ahead of Dawes and immediately rode to the home of Reverend Jonas Clark, Lexington's Congregationalist minister, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. Sergeant William Monroe, who was safeguarding the house, told Revere to be quiet lest his noise wake those inside. To this Revere shouted in reply,
"Noise! You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out."
Revere then began pounding on the front door. From an upstairs window, Clark asked who was there. Revere answered that he wished to see Mr. Hancock. Clark tried to question him further, but Hancock shouted from another window, "Come in, Revere. We are not afraid of you." Once informed of the situation, Hancock and Adams, eager to avoid capture, made plans to leave at once.
Around the same time, between midnight and 12:30, the last of Lieutenant Colonel Smith's troops finally disembarked on the Cambridge shore.
After delivering their warning to Hancock and Adams, Revere and Dawes continued on toward Concord. They were soon joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott of Concord. Around 1 a.m. the three men were surprised, near Lincoln, by a British patrol led by Major Edward Mitchell. Revere was captured while Prescott and Dawes managed to escape. The British tried to interrogate Revere, but with little success. At one point, Major Mitchell, frustrated at Revere's evasiveness, pressed his pistol to Revere's head and threatened to blow his brains out if Revere did not answer his question. While Mitchell continued to interrogate Revere, Prescott spread the alarm, arriving at Concord about 1:30 a.m. Dawes later claimed that he was chased for several miles by British officers before being thrown from his horse and forced to walk back to Lexington, but the exact details of his fate that night remain unclear.
It was almost 2 o'clock before the British main body finally departed Cambridge, hours late, to begin their march to Concord. It took them about an hour to reach the town of Monotony, at which point Lieutenant Colonel Smith ordered Major Pitcairn to take the 6 light infantry companies, at the head of the column, and march ahead to Concord. Pitcairn was instructed to secure the bridges at Concord, and hold them until Smith arrived with the main force. About 30 minutes later, at 3:30 a.m., Pitcairn encountered Major Mitchell's scouting party, which reported that a large body of militia was waiting for the British at Lexington, approximately 5 miles away.
Indeed, the militia had been gathering at Lexington for several hours, even before Revere and Dawes arrived. The commander of Lexington's militia company was 46-year-old Captain John Parker, an experienced officer and French and Indian War veteran, who was dying of tuberculosis. In an attempt to locate the approaching regulars, Captain Parker sent 2 scouts toward Cambridge. One scout returned within a few minutes, reporting that he had found no sign of the British troops. In the absence of any immediate threat, Parker dismissed his company but cautioned the men to remain within earshot. Parker's second scout was captured by Pitcairn's advance guard and so never returned. While Parker's men waited for further developments, Revere, who had since been released, returned to the Clark house and was stunned to find that Hancock and Adams were still there. They were in Reverend Clark's parlor, locked in a heated argument over Hancock's desire to take part in the coming battle, despite having almost no military training or experience. Adams vigorously argued against Hancock's foolhardy scheme, telling Hancock that as members of the cabinet, fighting in the ranks was not their business. Together, Adams and Revere managed to convince Hancock to leave for a safe house several miles north. In making his escape, Hancock left behind his fiancée, Dorothy Quincy, and his aunt, Lydia Hancock, to fend for themselves. After delivering Adams and Hancock to safety, Revere and Hancock's secretary, John Lowell, returned to the Clark house. It was now around 4 a.m. when Lowell suddenly remembered that a trunk belonging to Hancock had carelessly been left behind at Buckman's Tavern, and which contained much incriminating material, including documents from the Provincial Congress and Hancock's correspondence with committees of safety throughout the colony. Lowell persuaded Revere to return to Buckman's Tavern and retrieve the trunk before it fell into British hands. At 4:30, word reached Lexington that the regulars were less than half a mile from town. Captain Parker immediately had his drummer beat to arms and summoned everyone within earshot to muster on the green.
Meanwhile, hearing the sound of drumming from Lexington Green, Major Pitcairn halted his troops and ordered them to load their muskets.
While Revere and Lowell hauled Hancock's trunk out of Buckman's Tavern, the militiamen, numbering about 60 or 70, mustered in front of the tavern and then formed up on the northern end of the green. As Revere and Lowell made their way through the line of militia, Revere heard Parker instruct his men, "Let the troops pass by, don't molest them, without they being first." Parker was also quoted as saying,
"Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here."
At 5 a.m., matters took a radical turn as some of Pitcairn's companies, rather than turning left toward Concord, headed up Bedford Road, directly into the line of sight of Parker's militia company, while the remaining companies turned toward Concord. There now followed, in quick succession, a series of unforeseen but fairly predictable events that would plunge the two sides into war. A British officer, some claim it was Pitcairn while others assert that it was Mitchell, rode across the line of British infantry and supposedly shouted,
"Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse."
The militia, acting on Parker's instructions, started to withdraw when somebody, and nobody knows who, fired a shot. To a man, the colonists claimed that the British fired first.
The British were equally insistent that the rebels had fired first. Whoever fired first, the result was almost automatic as the British line opened fire, killing 8 colonists and wounding 9 or 10 others. Those killed in this melee, it could hardly be called a battle, included Captain Parker's cousin, Jonas Parker, as well as Jonathan Harrington, Isaac Muzzy, Robert Monroe, Samuel Hadley, John Brown, Isabel Porter, and Caleb Harrington. As black powder smoke spread across the green, the regulars advanced with bayonets. Those among the remaining militiamen who could, quickly ran for their lives. Those who could not, soon met a grisly fate. The only British casualties were one infantryman who was wounded in the leg and Major Pitcairn's horse, which was nicked in 2 places. Into this scene of carnage came Lieutenant Colonel Smith with his remaining companies of light infantry and grenadiers. Pitcairn's men were in disarray, with dead and wounded rebels scattered across the green. While the British officers struggled to regain control of their troops, Smith ordered a nearby drummer to beat to arms. As sergeants got their men back into ranks, Colonel Smith held an officer's call and informed his subordinates for the first time of their objective, seizing the stores at Concord. Smith had his men fire their weapons in a victory salute and raised 3 cheers. The British then reformed and marched west toward Concord.
As the British departed, Parker reassembled his company, who stared in disbelief at the sight of dead and mangled bodies strewn about the green. At Concord, by 6:30 a.m., Members of the local militia were engaged in a fierce debate regarding their next course of action. Should they advance and confront the British or hold back and wait for their arrival? The town elders, most of whom were French and Indian War veterans, strongly urged caution. A scout had been sent to Lexington to gather intelligence, but had rushed back to Concord after witnessing the initial firing without learning the outcome. Lacking specific knowledge of what had occurred at Lexington, the elders were hesitant to confront the king's troops, especially since they would probably be both outnumbered and outgunned. They believed it wiser to await further developments and reinforcements. Meanwhile, a group of about 150 Minutemen had taken position on a hill east of town to watch for the approaching regulars. Even after these Minutemen withdrew to Concord, upon spotting the British, the debate continued whether they should defend the town or withdraw to higher ground. Ultimately, it was decided to follow the advice of 64-year-old Colonel James Barrett and withdraw north to Punkatasset Hill, about a mile north of Concord.
The British arrived at Concord sometime between 7:30 and 8 a.m. The time is by no means certain, and some accounts put the British arrival as early as 7 o'clock. By this time, approximately 450 militia and Minutemen were gathered north of town in the vicinity of Punkatasset Hill. Lieutenant Colonel Smith divided his forces to secure the town's bridges. Smith detached about 100 men under Captain Monday Pole to secure the South Bridge. Captain Lawrence Parsons was dispatched to the North Bridge with 6 light infantry companies. From there, Parsons took 3 of these companies, about 120 men, guided by Ensign Henry de Bernier, west to Colonel Barrett's farm, where a stockpile of munitions was rumored to be located. Most of the munitions had already been removed, and the little that remained was well hidden. 2 other companies, totaling about 80 men, were deployed to a pair of low hills not far to the west, leaving Captain Walter S. Laurie with about 40 men to guard the North Bridge. The remaining companies of light infantry and grenadiers, roughly 500 men in total, stayed in the center of Concord under Colonel Smith's direct command. The troops in Concord began searching houses in town but found little contraband, most of which was set on fire near the courthouse. The fire soon got out of control and spread to the courthouse. The smoke from this fire would be visible for miles around. At the urging of a resident, Mrs. Martha Moulton, the troops formed a bucket brigade to fight the fire. Up at the North Bridge, Captain Laurie was growing increasingly nervous. With only about 40 men to defend the bridge, Laurie felt vulnerable as he observed the growing numbers of rebel militia up on Punkatasset Hill. Moreover, Laurie was aware that Parsons's 3 companies were almost 2 miles away to the west at Barrett's farm. About 400 yards from Laurie's position, the other 2 companies deployed on the 2 knolls in front of him.
It was now about 9 a.m., and on Punkatasset Hill, Colonel Barrett's militia companies were becoming increasingly alarmed by the sight of smoke rising from the direction of Concord. Believing that the British were burning the town, and being unaware of the Bucket Brigade's efforts to fight the fire, Barrett's men were eager to march south toward the bridge. Colonel Barrett and Major John Buttrick were conferring with their officers, when Lieutenant Joseph Hosmer, pointing to the cloud of black smoke rising from near the common, pointedly asked his superiors, "Will you stand here and let them burn the town down?" In response, Barrett gave the order to march.
As he watched the militia advancing towards him and his men, at the North Bridge, Captain Laurie realized that the best defensive position was on the eastern side of the bridge. Accordingly, Laurie ordered his men to fall back across the bridge, tearing up planks as they went to impede the pursuing rebels.
From the colonists' perspective, this destruction of property appeared to confirm their suspicion that the smoke rising from the town was intentional. At this point, Major Buttrick announced that if his men agreed, he would drive the British away from the bridge and prevent further destruction. As Colonel Barrett later recalled, "We all said we would go." Buttrick then ordered his men to load their weapons, but gave strict orders not to fire until they fired first, then to fire as fast as we could. Captain Isaac Davis and the Acton Minuteman Company followed, along with several other companies.
As the British scrambled back across the bridge and regrouped, a shot again rang out. This time almost certainly fired by the British, followed by a full volley from their ranks.
It was now about 9:30 a.m. when Captain Isaac Davis ordered his men to return fire. A second volley from the regulars then struck down two provincials, Captain Davis and Lieutenant Abner Hosmer, dead. Solomon Smith quoted Major Buttrick as exclaiming, "Fire, for God's sake, fire." 2 British soldiers were killed in this exchange, and a third was left bleeding on the ground.
While all this was happening, back in Concord, Lieutenant Colonel Smith and Major Pitcairn were supervising the Bucket Brigade when Lieutenant Alexander Robertson rode up with an urgent plea for assistance from Captain Laurie at the North Bridge. Smith quickly assembled 2 companies of grenadiers, about 60 men in all, and personally set off for the bridge. Meanwhile, everyone seemed to have forgotten about Captain Parsons and his troops, who were still searching the Barrett house and farm west of the North Bridge. The militiamen, fixated on British actions in the town, ignored this potential threat in their rear. The regulars were preparing to burn some gun carriages when they were interrupted by the sound of musket fire coming from the direction of the North Bridge. Captain Parsons immediately formed his troops and began marching back to Concord. After firing several volleys, Captain Laurie's men also started to fall back toward Concord, essentially leaving Captain Parsons and his men stranded in a sea of heavily armed rebels, until they met up with the 2 companies of grenadiers that Colonel Smith had dispatched from Concord.
Major Buttrick's Minutemen, along with the militia companies from Acton and Concord, scrambled over the partially dismantled North Bridge, where they found 2 British regulars dead and a third soldier wounded on the ground, who was subsequently killed by a rebel's hatchet blow to the head. Almost simultaneously, the rebels spotted the British grenadiers approaching from Concord. Major Buttrick ordered his men to take cover and to wait until the British came closer. When the time was right, Buttrick would give the word to fire.
However, after halting for about 10 minutes, the grenadiers then turned around and headed back to Concord in support of Captain Laurie's retreat.
As the British reassembled in Concord, the rebel militia appeared dazed and confused by what had just taken place and, for the moment, at least, uncertain of what to do next. Largely leaderless at this point, the rebels began to filter back across the North Bridge and eventually wandered toward Punkatasset Hill.
In the midst of this chaos, Captain Parsons and his men marched in from Barrett's farm. With no other British troops in sight and hundreds of armed rebels milling about in a state of confusion, the situation might have been comical if it hadn't been so hazardous. In fact, had Parsons halted his troops, they could have faced disaster. However, Parsons wisely kept his men moving until they were safely across the bridge. Ultimately, it was only the rebel militia's disorganized state that allowed Parsons' men to escape unscathed. Meanwhile, Captain Laurie and the supporting grenadiers had also returned safely to the town common in Concord. And, as Major Pitcairn recalled the search parties, Captain Monday Pole and his men were ordered back from the South Bridge. At this point, Colonel Smith rode to the top of the cemetery hill, north of the common, to survey the scene. While he was relieved to have his command safely reunited in Concord, as Smith looked to the east, he saw no sign of Perce's relief column, only growing numbers of rebels approaching Concord from every direction. Around noon, with the situation rapidly deteriorating, Smith decided he could wait for Percy no longer and finally gave the order to march. With that decision, the British began their withdrawal back to Boston. It soon became apparent that the return trip would be much more difficult than the morning trek had been. Smith's delay in leaving Concord allowed news of the events in Lexington to spread throughout the countryside. As a result, the British now found themselves surrounded by hundreds of colonial riflemen, turning their retreat to Boston into a continuous 15-mile running battle. As many historians have noted over the years, it was during the march back to Boston that the real battle took place on April 19th.
The fighting was especially fierce at Miriam's Corner, a crossroads located approximately a mile east of Concord, where the rebels closed in on Smith's column from east and north, pouring a deadly fire into the British ranks as the soldiers were forced to cross a narrow bridge, only 3 abreast, thus creating a severe bottleneck that turned the British troops into virtual sitting ducks, making them easy targets for the sharpshooting rebels.
By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the British were in serious trouble. They were low on ammunition, physically and mentally exhausted, and surrounded by hostile rebels. Surrender seemed to be the only viable option, an unthinkable prospect for the proud redcoats. Just west of Lexington, as rebel minutemen and militiamen closed in for the kill, Smith's men spotted a line of red uniforms just beyond the green. It was General Percy at last. Ordered to march at 5 o'clock that morning, both the regulars and Marines had overslept by several hours, and it was nearly 9 a.m. before Percy's troops finally set out for Concord. Judged from a modern perspective, Percy's lethargy and lack of urgency seem like a flagrant dereliction of duty, particularly in the British Army that placed so much emphasis upon good order and discipline. However, for Lieutenant Colonel Smith and his men, Percy's delayed arrival likely felt like a classic case of better late than never. Percy deployed his force, which included 2 artillery field pieces, on a hill overlooking Lexington Green, where they effectively commanded the town. While the artillery kept the rebels at bay, Smith's men passed through Percy's ranks and took shelter near Monroe's Tavern. To prevent their use by rebel snipers, Percy ordered several nearby houses to be burned and had his troops share their rations with Smith's men. After allowing Smith's men to rest for about 30 minutes, Percy issued orders to move. At 3:30, the British resumed their march to Boston with the rebels in hot pursuit. Although the worst may have been behind them, the British still faced several hours of hard marching and hard fighting before finally reaching Boston and the safety of their lines around 7:30 that evening.
The battles of Lexington and Concord were over, and the siege of Boston had begun. It would drag on for 11 months before finally ending in March 1776, when the British evacuated to Nova Scotia. In retrospect, the day's events had been a disaster for the British, as literally nothing had gone according to plan. What began as a search and destroy mission soon devolved into a day-long, bloody nightmare. Losses, for both sides, are difficult to assess. Best estimates put British casualties at between 243 and 273, including 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, 18 of them officers. Rebel casualties totaled approximately 95 individuals, with 50 killed or mortally wounded and 39 wounded. These figures do not include civilian casualties, of which there were many. Despite the bloodshed and bitterness the day had brought, the two sides had not yet reached the point of no return. There was still a chance, although a slim one, of averting disaster.
And that's the way it was 250 years ago today. This concludes our special episode of Project 250. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please tell a friend. And if you like what you see on this channel, make sure to like, share and subscribe. You can also check us out on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Substack. A reminder that our regular series of episodes will resume a week from today, April 26th, 2026, and continue on a weekly basis, with new episodes posting every Saturday at noon. Thank you for watching.